statement took him 40 minutes to write. That was fast for Marcos Salcedo Ruiz. In 6 years as senior policy advisor to the Colombian presidency, he had developed a reputation for precision that made speed unusual, for reading a draft 3 times before signing off, for returning documents to junior staff with marginal notes so dense they sometimes exceeded the original text. His colleagues described him as thorough. The president described him, in a moment of private humor that Salcedo Ruiz had appreciated, as the man who could find the ambiguity in a grocery list. But the statement he wrote on the morning of March 14, 1990, took 40 minutes. He wrote it alone, in his office on the 3rd floor of the Casa de Nariño, with the door closed and the phone directed to his assistant. He wrote it by hand first, then typed it himself on the machine on the corner of his desk, rather than giving it to the typing pool. The statement was 4 sentences. It identified Pablo Escobar by name, described him as a common criminal whose strategic importance had been systematically overstated by international media, and asserted that the Colombian government's position was one of law enforcement rather than political negotiation, that the state did not bargain with criminals, and that characterizing the situation as anything more complex than a law enforcement matter served only to elevate men who did not deserve elevation. Salcedo Ruiz read it twice after typing it. He found nothing to change. He signed it and gave it to his assistant for distribution at the 11 o'clock press briefing. He went back to his other work. By noon, the statement had been read on 3 radio stations and quoted in the afternoon wire dispatches. By 1 o'clock, it had reached Medellin. The Casa de Nariño in 1990 was a building that operated on the specific energy of a government under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The narcotics crisis had compressed what would ordinarily have been years of political development into months of emergency response. Men who had trained for careers of careful institutional advancement found themselves making decisions in compressed timeframes with incomplete information, and the quality of those decisions varied, and everyone in the building knew it varied, and no one said so directly. Salcedo Ruiz had been one of the steadier presences. He was 44 years old that spring, young enough to still carry ambition, old enough to have developed the judgment that ambition requires to become something other than appetite. He had studied law in Bogotá and political economy in London, and he had returned to Colombia with the specific conviction of a man who has seen his country from the outside and chosen to come back to it. He believed in institutions. He believed in the capacity of the state to assert itself against forces that sought to replace or capture it. He believed that the language used to describe a problem shaped the solutions available to address it. And he had watched over the previous 2 years as the language around Escobar had gradually shifted from the vocabulary of law enforcement into something that sounded uncomfortably like the vocabulary of geopolitics. That was what the statement was about, not Escobar specifically. The man was, in Salcedo Ruiz's assessment, exactly what the statement said he was: a criminal, dangerous, resourceful, embedded in systems of protection and complicity that made him difficult to address, but a criminal. The danger, as Salcedo Ruiz saw it, was in the alternative framing, in the suggestion that the situation required negotiation rather than prosecution, that the man had interests that the state should weigh alongside its own. That framing conceded something that should not be conceded. The statement was a correction. He believed this. He had written it quickly because he believed it clearly. At 2:15 in the afternoon, his assistant knocked and said there was a file on his desk that had not been there when she left for lunch. The file was thin, a plain manila folder, no label on the outside. His assistant had not seen who left it. The door to his office had been unlocked during the lunch hour. It was almost always unlocked during the day. The building operated on the assumption of internal security, and anyone with access to the corridor could have placed it there. Salcedo Ruiz sat down and opened it. Inside were 11 pages. No cover letter, no identifying information. The first 3 pages were a summary of financial transactions, accounts, dates, amounts, that he spent several minutes reading before understanding what he was looking at. The accounts were not his. The names attached to them were not his. But the patterns in the transactions connected, through several layers of intermediary, to a family property transaction from 1987 that he recognized. A land purchase in Cundinamarca that had involved, through a cousin's law firm, to the financing arrangement, to a source of funds that, traced back through the pages in the file, led somewhere that the documents left unnamed, but that the architecture of the information made unmistakable. He read the 11 pages twice. Then he set the file flat on his desk and looked at the wall across from him for a long time. The connection was real or it was constructed. He did not know which. The cousin was legitimate. He had no reason to believe otherwise. The law firm was legitimate. The transaction had been a normal property transaction as far as Salcedo Ruiz had ever known. But the documents in the file presented it differently, and the documents were detailed enough and internally consistent enough that the difference between real and constructed was not something he could resolve sitting at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. What he could resolve was simpler and more immediate, that the file existed, that it was on his desk hours after the statement was distributed, and that both of those facts were the content of a communication that required no signature and no return address. He understood the communication. He sat with it for 40 minutes, the same amount of time it had taken him to write the statement that morning, though the symmetry did not occur to him until much later. At 3 o'clock, he called his assistant and asked her to get the president's chief of staff on the phone. The conversation was brief. He said he needed to meet with the chief of staff before the end of the day. The chief of staff said he had time at 4. Salcedo Ruiz said 4 was fine. He spent the hour between calls reviewing the file once more and drafting 2 documents. The first was a 1-page memorandum addressed to the chief of staff. It described the file, its contents, and the circumstances of its arrival in precise and neutral language. It did not reach any conclusions about the source or the intention. It stated the facts as Salcedo Ruiz understood them and indicated that he believed the situation required disclosure and response at a level above his position. The second document was a single paragraph. It contained his resignation. At 4 o'clock, he walked down the corridor to the chief of staff's office and sat across from a man he had worked alongside for 3 years. He put both documents on the desk. He explained the situation in the same neutral language he had used in the memorandum. He answered questions. He said he did not believe the underlying connection was legitimate. He believed the file was constructed. But he said this once and did not argue it when the chief of staff looked at him with the expression of a man for whom the distinction between real and constructed had become, in the context of this particular afternoon, secondary to the existence of the file itself. He said he understood. He stood up. He shook the chief of staff's hand and walked back down the corridor to his office and collected his jacket and his personal items, which were few. He told his assistant he would not be coming in the next day and that she should coordinate with his deputy. He thanked her for her work. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read and said something he could not fully hear, and he nodded and walked to the elevator. He was in the car by 4:40. The resignation was announced the following morning in a 2-sentence internal communication that attributed it to personal reasons. The statement Salcedo Ruiz had written about Escobar remained on the record. No one retracted it. No one referenced it in connection with his departure. He moved to a private law practice in Bogota and maintained a careful distance from political work for the remainder of that decade. He was not invisible. He consulted. He taught a seminar at the law faculty. He wrote occasional pieces for academic journals on questions of institutional design. But the proximity to the center of things that had defined his career through his 30s was gone, and he did not seek to recover it. His colleagues from the Casa de Nariño understood, without being told, that something had happened. The specific nature of what had happened was not discussed because the specific nature was the kind of thing that, in Bogota in 1990, was understood more clearly when not spoken than when spoken. Salcedo Ruiz did not speak about it. In 2005, he agreed to participate in a long-form interview project conducted by a political historian at the Universidad de los Andes, documenting the institutional history of the Colombian state during the Escobar years. The interview ran across 2 sessions. Most of what was discussed concerned policy architecture, the mechanics of institutional decision-making under pressure, the structural challenges facing the Colombian state during that period. Near the end of the second session, the historian asked about the resignation. Salcedo Ruiz was quiet for a moment. He described the file. He described its arrival. He described the 40 minutes in which he had sat with it before calling the chief of staff. He spoke precisely and without dramatization, the habits of the policy professional persisting even across 15 years. The historian asked whether he believed the file's contents were fabricated. "I believe they were assembled," Salcedo Ruiz said. "There is a difference. Nothing in the file was invented from nothing. The transaction happened, the cousin existed, the law firm existed. What was assembled was a particular reading of those facts, a reading that could be argued against, that I believe could have been argued against successfully, but that would have required time and resources and a kind of public exposure that would have consumed whatever remained of my effectiveness." He paused. The point was not to produce something true. The point was to produce something that required a response, and the required response was the resignation. The historian asked if he regretted writing the statement. Salcedo Ruiz considered this. "No," he said. "The statement was correct. Escobar was a criminal. The language of negotiation, of political weight, of interest to be balanced, that was a concession the state should not have been making. And I believed that then, and I believe it now." A pause. "What I regret, if that is the right word, is the assumption I was carrying when I wrote it. The assumption that clarity was sufficient, that if the statement was correct, it would simply be correct, and the correctness would be its own protection." He looked at his hands. "I had confused precision with safety. They are not the same thing." The historian asked what he remembered most clearly about that afternoon. Salcedo Ruiz looked at the table between them. "The symmetry," he said. 40 minutes to write the statement. 40 minutes sitting with the file before I picked up the phone." He paused. "I don't think that was accidental. The file was calibrated, designed to take exactly as long to understand as it took. Not so complicated that I would seek outside help before acting. Complicated enough that 40 minutes was the right amount of time to arrive at the only conclusion available." Another pause. "That kind of precision is not random. That is someone who understood exactly how I would think." The recorder on the table continued running. The historian wrote something in his notebook. Outside, the campus moved through its ordinary afternoon. Neither man said anything further. There was nothing further to say that the silence had not already said more clearly. There is a particular kind of defeat that does not announce itself as defeat. It arrives dressed as a Tuesday afternoon, as a manila folder on a desk, as 40 minutes of sitting with something and arriving, by the end of those 40 minutes, at the only conclusion the situation permits. Salcedo Ruiz had spent 6 years in a building full of men who understood power as the accumulation of position, of title, access, proximity to decisions. He had shared that understanding, more or less. He had believed that what he had built across those years was robust enough to sustain a statement of 4 correct sentences about a man who was, demonstrably and without serious question, a criminal. He had not understood that power in the form that mattered in Bogota in 1990 was not measured in the accuracy of statements. It was measured in the cost of making them. And the cost of a statement was not set by the person who made it. It was set by the person who received it. That was what the 40 minutes taught him. Not that he had been wrong, that being right was not the variable he had thought it was. He carried this quietly for 15 years, through the law practice and the faculty seminars and the journal articles on institutional design. He carried it the way a man carries a correction to something he used to believe. Not as a wound, not as a lesson exactly, but as a permanent adjustment to how he read the rooms he entered. A recalibration that had no external expression, but was present in everything that followed. When he finally spoke about it, to the historian with the recorder on the table between them, he spoke the way men speak when a thing has been carried long enough that the carrying is finished. Not with relief, with the flat precision of a man returning something to its proper place in the account of events, where it could be read by whoever came after and understood as part of the record. He had written a correct statement. He had resigned the same afternoon. And the man whose name appeared in 4 sentences of clear institutional language had never once appeared in the same room, had never made a call, had never sent a messenger, had only sent 11 pages in a plain folder with no label on the outside. That was enough. It had always been enough. It was always enough.